Welcome back to Farms and Frontlines. I'm your host, Max Terzano, and I am joined, as always, by Major Jessica Rudo.
Hey there.
Today, we're going to talk about something actually pretty cool that, Jess, you wrote your thesis on. Avocados, the foodstuff trade between Mexico and their relationship with the Mexican drug cartels.
Yeah, it was really based off of one headline that I saw in a news article, and it was the drug cartels are extorting the avocado industry. And I'm like, wait, what?
Yeah, I mean, that's not exactly something you read and you're just like, yeah, all right, I get it.
Yeah, I'm like, but why?
That seems rude.
Like, I know. I'm like, drugs make so much money. Why do they need to do anything else?
Right.
So yeah, and it took me down a rabbit hole that ended up becoming my thesis. So it's crazy. I think it's interesting and eye-opening onto like how our food systems work and how other people can, benefit from it, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I mean, I remember the first time you were telling me about this. You were still, I guess, in school, and
Mhm.
and and you were just saying like, yeah, I'm writing about like avocados and drug cartels. I was like, wait a minute,
I know.
go on, because
I'm like
that's actually super interesting. And
at the same
then
time?
yeah, like together, you're doing two theses. What?
Yeah.
But it was really cool. And then just on top of that, just more recently when we started talking about doing this as a potential episode, you kind of went back into like the history of the drug cartels, and I think that was really fascinating to me because it goes all the way back to like California and the gold rush and Chinese immigration and opium and all that crazy
Yeah.
stuff. It's like it's a big part of American history if you want to understand like how these Mexican drug cartels came about and how they're thriving. It
Yeah.
started in the U.S.
Yeah,
Shocker.
it's pretty well, yes. Yeah, I think, everything is very complicated, right? It's a complicated story, but to really understand it, right, kind of going back to the origins, when I was doing my research, I took it all the way back to the opium trade. And really, I guess you could blame it on the British because
I'm 100% behind that.
really, it's
Great, perfect.
I know. Way to go.
That'll
Yet
be our
again.
podcast tagline, actually. Farms and Frontlines. Blame it on the British.
Yeah, exactly. But I took it in my research all the way back to like really the Opium Wars, where even just that in itself, right? The British going to war twice with the Chinese and the Chinese government for the right to trade opium because
Yeah, yeah.
the Chinese government was like, no, we don't want to make it legal. It's not
Stop it.
beneficial, Yeah.
Yeah,
They're not, when people are on opium, according to the Chinese government, they're kind of lackadaisical. They don't want to work.
yeah.
We don't want our like brand to be associated with that kind of behavior. So they were
It's
like,
kind of silly because they're kind of just like
yeah,
saying to the British, like, hey, yeah, this is a drug.
no, thank you.
Like, yeah, like, no, you don't. What?
But a habit that the Chinese had in China was smoking opium.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking, the mid 1800s here. But in America, opium was also used, but it was not the habit of smoking. It was not here in the United States. It was
It
not prevalent.
was it was more like in medicines and stuff, right?
Yeah, right. And same with cocaine. So opium, cocaine, other types of like pain relievers you could buy like in like an apothecary or a pharmacy or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it's like for kids, like their teeth, like
Oh my gosh.
toothache stuff. You know what I mean?
Right,
Like
right,
your
right.
teeth.
It was
Your
like that
baby's
old.
got teeth coming in, put cocaine on their gums, and
Let's
they'll
stop
be all
crying.
right. So, not uncommon. That was what was done, right?
Yeah.
So at this, when we're talking about this again, like mid 1800s, these are not illegal things. So the Opium Wars cause a lot of devastation. Following the Opium Wars, there's a drought, and the people that are affected the most by both of these things are really the peasants. And
Mm-hmm.
they start to migrate, and they migrate to the western border of the Americas. So you'll see an influx in Chinese immigration in both North America and then parts of like Mexico and South America.
Okay.
And it happens around the same time so the Mexican American War happens 1846 to 1848,
Mm-hmm.
and 1849, right? The 49ers.
Mm-hmm.
Gold is found in California. So America had just recently acquired this land from Mexico, and gold is found. And this also motivates immigration to California. So you see an influx in Chinese immigration happening to California, fueled by the gold rush and the availability for work. So the gold rush brings about other industries, right? So railroads are coming about.
Hmm.
A lot of stuff dealing with mining requires labor, and the Chinese are filling those labor roles.
Right.
Something that happens is, they're paid a certain wage, but then they're also paid in opium. And you'll start to see the habit of smoking opium coming around, flourishing around these like work sites.
Right.
So it starts to show up, in California around mining sites and railroad sites. So at some point it's tolerated, and then when there is a job shortage, it starts to become not tolerated because it's associated with the Chinese who are taking jobs, right? They're like
Right.
the South Park
Yeah. They took
episode.
our
They took our
jobs.
job. They took our
Yeah.
job.
Yeah. Yep.
And there is an increase in anti-Chinese sentiment. If you look at, there's if we have the ability to like put some of these things underneath, like associated with this episode, but there's propaganda, even like laundry detergent. Laundry detergent was very racist and very anti-Chinese, and it was like, hey, you need to be more American and buy your own laundry detergent. Don't take it to like a
A
laundry
Chinese
facility.
laundry.
Yeah, Chinese
Yeah.
laundry or something like that. And there's stuff like that in everything. So it leads to eventually the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's passed in the 1880s, and it basically bans immigration of Chinese to the US. Following that is a ban on the Chinese able to buy opium, because opium sales were not uncommon, but
Right.
you could purchase opium for use. But again, that habit of smoking opium was very like, this is not okay.
Yeah. Gaining more negative attention.
Yeah, it was absolutely like, that's disgusting.
Right. Because it
You
was.
put
Was it just because people were like, "Hey, that's a bad drug," and you're becoming super lazy, or because it's like that's something the Chinese do?
that's something the Chinese do. This is
Gotcha.
what the Chinese do, and we don't like anything about the Chinese at this point,
Right.
right?
Okay.
So it becomes very much like, no, no, this is terrible.
Hmm.
So right, first, it's the banning of any more immigration of Chinese to the U.S., and then Chinese are not allowed to buy opium. But that doesn't stop the demand for opium. So what happens within the United States, really, I look at it like almost like an entrepreneurial spirit. Like there is a demand that is not being met.
Hmm.
So other people that were in no way associated with buying or selling opium now become involved in it. It's the middle-aged white woman. It's like anybody, right? Like
Yeah.
anybody is like, you need that. I see that you want it. I'm going to buy it and upcharge you, and you can buy it from me.
I'm gonna
And
make a
so
profit.
they made a profit, right? So it becomes a lucrative, not well, it becomes a decent business where other people that would not have any other way been associated with opium or this drug trade have now been brought into it because the Chinese are prohibited from buying it themselves.
And
So that's
this may be neither here nor there, but like you say, it's like decently semi lucrative, but like these middle aged white women, this was a
mhm.
time where like they weren't really working.
No, and they're one of the biggest consumers of like these over-the-counter drugs.
Right.
Um, like when Coca-Cola has actual Coke in it, like the
Hmm.
biggest consumer is actually middle-aged white women.
Well, there you
Uh,
go.
yeah, I know. Whoops.
Oops.
It's tough. It's tough being a housewife, man. Like,
Got to do something.
well, it also just, I mean, that's a totally different topic, but it talks to like how, what quality of life did they have where they felt like they needed to be like drugged most
Yeah,
of the
no,
day,
exactly. I think
right?
that's definitely something that we could talk about on one of those like Patreon
Yeah,
episodes. That'd be a lot of fun.
yeah, yeah. If you're, like we're laughing at it, but obviously they were miserable, right? Like otherwise they
Yeah,
wouldn't eat it.
yeah, they wouldn't be seeking out cocaine and opium.
Yeah, and Ladolum was the other one.
Oh yeah,
Um,
laudanum. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
oh, laudanum, is that how you say it?
yeah,
Laudanum?
laudanum.
Oh, geez,
At
I've been
least that's how they say it in the movie Tombstone.
been saying it wrong for like 5 years now.
And no one corrected you.
Whoops.
That's respect.
Well, nobody knows any better. They don't know any better. Like, okay, yeah, sure, okay, yep.
Well, I mean,
Anywho,
now I'm second guessing myself, but I'm going to stick with it.
laudanum.
Laudanum, yeah.
Okay, okay. Ah. So that's that part of it, right? So now we have
Yeah.
a new segment of the population that is now dealing with or hands-on drugs. The other part of that, so the Chinese are now banned from immigrating to the US. That doesn't stop the desire to get out of China. And they instead just like kind of like reroute themselves and go to Mexico.
Right.
And what we see there is the start of a human smuggling route where, it's mostly Chinese in Mexico help move newly immigrated Chinese into the US.
Gotcha.
And it starts these smuggling lines between Mexico and the United States. So we're setting the stage for what will later become drug routes. But in that same vein, it's people that were not associated with any type of smuggling now have an economic opportunity, just to move people across this border, which is now, I don't want to say it's arbitrary, but it's a newly formed border.
Right.
It's not like certain parts are not as contested as other parts. There's
I don't
definitely
want to
some
say.
there's
Sorry, I
definitely
didn't mean
some
to.
like there's lynchings that are happening. It's not like a fun place to be, the border, but there's certain parts where it's not there's not a need for a crackdown yet.
And I want to say there's not like maps are not readily availavailable,
I
like
mean
of
like a
the
tourist
borders.
map, like
Yeah, like
yeah.
just buy like an atlas of the United States at the time.
Yeah.
Like this is brand
Yeah.
new stuff.
Yeah. But there are custom houses, right? There are custom houses that will show up in the southern portion of California, and they report some of these like primary documents from the San Diego Custom House is showing some things that are just I found really fascinating. So I'll get to that in just a second, where the types of people who are being associated with these smuggling routes and then later the drug trafficking routes. So we're talking about people being smuggled in. We're talking about internal to the United States when the Chinese are banned from buying opium themselves. Later, it's going to become that opium is banned in general. And then opium, again, the demand doesn't go away. Just now the supply has gotten more complicated. And the opium will be moved from Mexico into the United States. And
Hmm.
again, so if we're looking at like who is associated with this, the Chinese are running that. The Chinese are the ones primarily running this first drug smuggling operation from certain parts of Mexico into the United States. But what I thought was really fascinating was who else is associated with this. And it was like every ethnicity that there could be, right? They mentioned Native Americans, they mentioned African Americans, they mentioned women, they mentioned men. Every ethnicity, both
Right.
sexes are in multiple spots around the United States. So it starts kind of in California, but then they have documents that show it's going to Chicago, it's
Wow.
going to the other side of the United States. Yeah, like every demographic is being represented, which I
Represented.
just
Yeah.
thought was so interesting.
I
This
guess.
equalizer is this illegal like movement of opium. It was
Yeah.
it was really fascinating. Like, wow, everybody came together to do this illegal
To do
activity.
this one bad thing. Yeah.
But
I guess the power of
yeah,
money and drugs. I don't
the
know.
power of drugs is the equalizing
The
factor.
power of drugs. Yeah. That's wild, especially at this
We've been
time
looking
period
at it.
where
We've been looking
like
at it all wrong. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, I mean like this is the time period where like you had said the Mexican American War was pretty recent. The Chinese Exclusion Act was new. Like people are
Yeah.
kind
So
of put into these pockets.
well, also, like, so Chinese exclusion in the 1880s. So we've passed the Civil War, but we're
Yeah.
in the Jim Crow era, like
Yeah.
Reconstruction,
The Indian Wars are
1880s.
fresh
Oh
in
yeah,
everybody's minds.
Indian wars have been going on for like 100 years by this
Yeah.
point. It's
Hmm.
they've been ongoing. I think everybody kind of forgets they like don't stop. Yeah, the Indian wars are going on, right? We are not like a cohesive unit. The United States is not like everybody's equal. Everybody's coming together and we love each other. We look at
No,
everyone equal. That is not happening in the
that's
1880s,
just
early
what
1900s. No.
drug smugglers are saying.
Yeah, but drug smugglers don't see race or
Yeah, yeah,
or
or
gender
gender, or
or gender.
yeah. Jeez,
I know. I just thought it was so crazy, right?
it really is.
Yeah. So anyway, so we move into prohibition, the prohibition of alcohol.
Hmm.
And this further strengthens these smuggling lines. It grows these smuggling lines. The growth of an alcohol industry in Mexico, and then also like international liquors coming into the United States, and that desire, right? That demand
Hmm.
is
Yeah,
massive. So there's a
and
huge market, right?
I guess they're just like we already have these lines, like these smuggling lines. We
Hmm.
might as well
Yeah.
use
Well,
it for
like
what you
there's
want now.
right. You've got these lines, but also like some techniques.
Hmm.
And there is innovation that's going on, right? They're using burrow, right? Are they burrows? Those like donkeys, mules.
Oh yeah,
Um,
burros.
oh, excuse me. Sorry. Excuse me. The burros.
There you go.
Um, and so you're seeing like different ways that things are getting moved. They're, continuing to innovate. And who is also involved in this smuggling also grows, right? There's a bigger Mexican input to move the alcohol. But then prohibition ends and that demand dries up. There's no need
Right.
for that to be smuggled anymore because now Americans can buy it in their homeland.
Hmm.
There has been quite a lucrative business that has come about from moving alcohol, but there's still a smuggling of drugs that is going on. And that
Right.
even up until like 30s ish, 40s, it's mostly Chinese that are like operating that.
Hmm.
After prohibition dries up, the Mexicans that have been dealing with the alcohol movement destroy the Chinese. They violently take them out and take over their drug smuggling operations.
This was
Like,
based in Mexico, right?
oh yeah, based in Mexico, right.
Right.
It's really the 1940s, and some of these that take over are like the roots of current day cartels. So we'll see the
Okay.
start of like the Gulf Cartel, who's a huge player. They start in like the 40s. I do think it's interesting too because we do see some women even in the 40s kind of taking like a leadership role in these Mexican drug, operations, which I just thought was interesting too.
It's I like, we're laughing. Obviously, like drug cartels are absolutely terrible,
Oh
but
yes,
like
right. Yeah.
very progressive.
Yeah, right? Yeah,
Like
right. Well,
shockingly so.
smart, right? Because nobody's associating women with the movement of drugs. So women had a lot more freedom of movement.
That makes sense.
Yeah, right. So they're like, well,
Can't be you.
well, they didn't, right? If they're like, well, hold on, these women got through no issue, that works. So let's
Right, right,
capitalize on
right.
that. And it just shows, I mean, even just this, and I've brought us up to like the 1940s, but like everybody associated with this is smart, right? They're smart, they're innovative, they're creative thinkers. Like we associate drug cartels current day with violence, which is definitely warranted
Warranted.
and
Yeah.
as it should be because they are. But there's brains behind these operations too. Like we can't be so dismissive to be like, oh my God, they're just like violence and like, but there's like
Yeah, they're not just
smart
straight up
people, yeah,
barbarians.
well, I mean,
Yeah.
they might be, but they're not knuckle draggers. Like
Hmm.
there's a brain behind there too, and that's maybe just
Scarier.
important. Yeah, exactly. Like important to point out because it's like that's even worse.
Yeah, yeah. Like, okay, great. They're violent and they,
Yeah,
sell drugs. But the only thing scarier than that is if they're smart as well.
they're smart too, and they're like
Yeah.
crafty, and they don't have a care for like human life anymore, like in general. But
Yeah.
it doesn't start that way, right? There is violence. The Mexicans violent take it over from the Chinese. That's the 40s, and then it kind of grows as demand grows in the United States. So the 60s kind of bring about this counterculture movement from Vietnam, anti-war protests, and
Hmm.
just this counterculture in general, right? There's like an awakening of even like from a history perspective, like we should be looking at like women's history. We should be looking at like black history. There's a moment in the 60s where it's like there's more to America than just like white men.
Yeah.
And there's
This is kind of like where they were looking at like the nuclear family and being like, that's not it.
or there's things in yeah, like whatever was like the norm, there's a push against it in like
Hmm.
several ways, right? It's not just I just pointing out like it's not just anti-war protests, but it's like anti like everything that is considered a norm right now is getting pushed
Right,
back.
right.
And associated with this counterculture movement is the smoking of marijuana.
Hmm.
So you'll see a huge rise in demand through the 60s and the 70s for marijuana. Supply was coming out of Mexico. So there's a big increase in what is happening in Mexico. And then the demand is so much that Mexico can't fulfill the orders.
Wow.
US drug traffickers actually go to Colombia and they start to talk up like certain areas in Colombia and they're like, "Hey,
Yeah.
you got a great climate here.
I don't see how this could go wrong at all.
How's about you stop growing corn and you start growing marijuana and then we could start our drug trade with you as well."
With you, and we'll pay you a
Yeah.
lot of money.
And, well, they never say a lot of money, but you could make a lot of money this way. Obviously we know that they go for it, right? And I'm saying
Yeah.
they in terms of farmers, and then
Yeah.
later it's gonna end up being like two massive cartels. It'll be end up the roots of like the Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel.
And are they
But
just in Colombia?
I mean now
Or
they're everywhere,
did
but
they
this is
just
starting
started
in
there? But
Colombia. Yeah.
okay, gotcha.
Yeah. I mean they're a multinational operation. It's gonna start in Colombia. And that's kind of how it starts. It starts with U.S. drug traffickers being like, we need more shit, and can you help us supply that? And they're like,
Right.
yep.
Yep.
Oh, yep. And
Mhm,
then weirdly, so right, there's a lot that's associated with, marijuana, the demand in marijuana, the movement of it. I don't know that it's smart to go into like more detail for this episode,
Yeah.
but right, it starts to transform the drug industry. You see millionaires coming about, a lot of power being centralized, and yeah, these smuggling routes are really not contested for the most part. They're able to really get product in, and that innovation comes about too. So Nixon will declare a war on drugs early in the 70s.
Okay.
And I don't remember what the operation is now, not Condor. There's an operation where he closes the border with Mexico, the US Mexico border, closes it down and like checks every single car. And it's hours and hours and hours, right? Like so bad, the backup
Oh,
is so bad that produce like goes bad in the backs of trucks,
was that
and they're like, yeah.
Operation Intercept?
Is it Intercept? Yeah, it's Intercept. You're right.
Okay, cool.
So
Sorry.
Operation Intercept. No, I was like, I know this. I studied it, and I can't remember it for anything.
I had to look it up
So yeah, Operation Intercept, and guess what? They find like almost no drugs.
because they're
Well, because
uh,
they're like, hey, they're checking every truck. They're like, all right, let me put it on a ship.
yeah. I
Let me
mean,
put it on
like
a plane. Yeah, yeah.
I think that
So
was like a recurring theme, like even back to like opium, like they kept thinking of new and interesting ways to get people
yeah.
the drugs that they wanted, you know?
Yeah, and the way that it's described, like a theory, is called the balloon effect. So, you put air in a balloon, you tie it off, but if you push on a balloon where you're pushing down, it looks like that air is gone, but it's just been displaced to a different part of the balloon. It doesn't go
Hmm.
anywhere. It's just moved to a different area. And that's kind of how the anti-drug operations are kind of looked at. They put pressure on one spot and maybe it's got some effects there, but it's affecting everywhere else in that balloon.
Right.
So you're right. So right, there's pressure on the border. All right, we just won't use the border. We'll just go around it. So yeah, there's an increase in like tuna ships being loaded with drugs and then brought up to the United States. You see people like George Young who would load up planes and fly it back, and then he ends up working for like Escobar later and stuff like that.
Oh man.
So movements of drugs going in just different directions. So
Right.
there's other things that happen too. So Nixon, is working with the Mexican government, and they start to send Mexican troops into local law enforcement to areas to like, hey, crack down on the actual supply, right? The thought is like, if we can knock out the supply, we can stop this drug problem, like right at
Hmm.
the beginning of it. And they spray like Agent Orange on
Oof, I did
on
not know that.
crops. They are like harassing farmers and their families, and it's very negative. So again, like the local supply is affected, but they just move to different areas, right? They move into areas like the state of Michoacan, which is important to talk about here because I'm going to bring it up again for avocados. They move marijuana growing into the hills of Michoacan. They move it
Right.
into deeper into Sinaloa. They just move it into different areas. So they didn't do anything. They just pushed it into areas that had nothing to do with drug operations. And now that area that is affected has grown. And they don't like the local law enforcement because they were kind of like not nice. they
Yeah,
were they were
yeah.
harassing them, right?
Because I guess in like the farmer's eyes, they're not like I'm doing anything wrong. They're just like I'm growing a crop and I'm selling to these guys.
Yeah, so some like firsthand accounts, the farmers would be like, they offered me $5 a bushel, and all I had to do was grow marijuana, cut it, tie it, and leave it down here at this like local stand, and somebody would come and pick it up and pay me $5 a bushel, versus like corn, which would be like $1 a bushel. So that's
Right. And then they had to like
economically, yeah,
grow,
economically, it makes
harvest,
sense.
and then
Yeah,
go to the
yeah,
store.
and sell themselves, right?
Yeah.
Find a consumer for it. Yeah, so I mean, that's what I would do. I mean, if somebody's paying me 5 times what I would make for
Yeah,
growing
for
a
like
different crop, like why not?
half the work. Like, yeah.
Yeah, like, seriously. I'm
And
not
it's
like,
not like they came in and were like, hey, you want to grow this drug?
mhm.
They're just like, hey,
I'm,
grow this crop
I will say that marijuana was illegal
in Mexico.
in Mexico before it was illegal in the United States.
Okay, okay.
Uh,
So the
yeah,
farmers did know then, like,
so they did know, yeah, but
this is
they're-
illegal, but I'm still gonna make a
yep,
lot of money.
yes, yeah, they.
Okay.
And I'm not advocating like, yeah, of course they should do that, but like, you can empathize like, all right, yeah, I'm
Yeah,
gonna
no,
make
I
one more
get
money. Yeah,
why. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, why wouldn't they? And you know, it's important to point out, because if somebody has like a motivating, how do you like counter that? How do you counter that motivation? You can't pay them $5 for corn. Like, nobody's going to buy the corn, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
So it is, you know, that part of it, it's just good to understand.
Mhm.
We're going to see that marijuana shift into cocaine. Cocaine becomes like glamorized in the 80s, like 70s and the early 80s. It's on the cover of Time magazine. It's in, like, you know, Hollywood is the people doing cocaine, so it becomes like a super fancy drug.
You happen to have a like a link to that Time magazine cover?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay,
I'll
cool.
send
'Cause
it to
I
you.
definitely want to put that up, like on a website or something where we can show like the just everything we've been talking about.
Oh yeah, 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 for
That'd be
sure.
pretty cool.
So what I want to point out with that is most of that cocaine is starting in Colombia, and it's moving into Miami. And Miami is such a like hub that its Federal Reserve has like $4 trillion in it,
Oh my
which
gosh.
is, it's like more than all the banks in the United States combined.
That's insane.
So
And you figure somebody would look at that and be like, "Hey, wait a minute."
yeah, the cash that's in there, everybody, and yeah, people are like, that can't be right.
Seems high.
That seems a little high. Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, well, and it kind of goes, oh, it's kind of tolerated until what's now called the cocaine cowboys start violence in Miami. So they're,
Right.
you know, we have become desensitized to gun violence. But when this happens, when rival drug cartel members shoot at each other in the middle of the day, it was like
Right.
lunchtime. And this was not a thing that happened ever. And so people were like, oh my God, what is going on in Miami? Like, this is
Yeah.
insane. And it, you know, it escalates, right? It starts with two people like shooting at each other. Well, several people from two gangs like shooting at each other. And then it just escalates. So Miami is having so many people die. It has to bring in like freezer trucks or whatever.
Bucks. Yeah.
Yeah, to put the dead bodies in because their morgues are too full.
Oh my gosh.
So they're going through like hundreds of deaths where like a typical day would have been like teens or something. Not day, like month.
Right. I
Um,
was gonna say, whew.
not day, sorry. A typical month would have been in the teens, and then they're in like the hundreds. So it's a huge influx, and they're reacting to that, yeah. And then of course everybody's like, "What's the deal with Miami?"
Yeah.
And the government does like a full, we are taking everything out of Miami, right? And it's a multi-agency task force that is created. And it's like the Army, the Navy, the DEA, CIA, like everybody, right? FBI.
Right.
And they descend into Miami and like try to clear it out. And they do a pretty good job. And then they start to move into the Caribbean, which is the way that it was moving from Colombia into Miami,
Hmm.
and shut down some of these corridors that are in the Caribbean. For the most part, they're pretty effective. This works pretty well short term. But again, similar, right? Like, okay, I
The balloon
can't
effect
get,
again.
it's the balloon effect, similar, where it's like, okay, I can't move cocaine from Colombia straight into Miami from the Caribbean. We're just going to take the long way and move it over land and move it through Central America into Mexico and then into the United States in a effect that they call it the trampoline effect.
Okay.
The Colombians and the cartels worked with the Mexican cartels, like, hey, we're going to hand this off to you, and then you worry about getting it into the United States, which, because they had already had that set up pretty well, right, with their
Right.
smuggling
Yeah.
routes,
Hmm.
with the Mexican smuggling routes. So it's putting cocaine in the hands of Mexican cartels, which is one thing to point out. Later, Colombia will pay them in cocaine. So they're getting paid like with money and then paid with cocaine, and they start their own cocaine trade, which increases like cash flow and power into these Mexican cartels, making them into like billionaires, right? We see millionaires turn to billionaires. There's tons of power and money associated with this cocaine movement because, again,
Right.
it's like through the roof in the 80s. I don't want to say things are going well for cartels, but it's pretty centralized. There's one kind of godfather. His name is Angel Gallardo. Uh, he is head of the Guadalajara Cartel. He's kind of the godfather, kind of controlling all the strings for everything that's going on in Mexico. Things are relatively going well in terms of like if you're looking at a cartel, but
Right.
the violence associated with cartels in the 80s is kind of minimal. It's definitely not what we think of today. Until a DEA agent, his name is Kiki Camarera,
Mm.
is killed, and he is killed like
Brutally. Yeah.
brutally. Yeah, they find his body a couple of days later, and then you know, they done messed up because then the U.S. is like, absolutely not, and
Yeah.
there's like a full force of like, you've touched one of ours and now we're going to just decimate you.
Right.
And go in and they arrest that godfather that I was just talking about, Gallardo.
Mhm.
And when he is out, when that figurehead is out, there is
Chaos.
now all the lieutenants that were under him are now fighting for smuggling routes, border checkpoints, land, power. They
Just trying to
start
grab
yep,
whatever
they
they
start
can from him, right?
they start infighting with each other, and that like weird equilibrium is now like totally out of whack, and that's going to lead us into fights over land, fights over who owns what smuggling route, smuggling territory, and that's going to evolve into extortion rackets, and that's that.
It's like it's kind of wild.
Yeah.
It's like the same exact thing when like you hear stories of like a medieval king who dies, but he had like 3 sons, and
Hmm.
then instead of one just being king, the other's like, no, I'm gonna also fight you for
Yeah.
this territory, and then you get 3
Yeah.
separate kingdoms.
Yeah, because there's still other
And
cartels, but they kind of listen to this Godfather
mhm,
until he's in prison, and I think he tries to run it from prison for a while, and then everybody else is kind of like breaking off. Like you
right,
see
like
the
why am I listening
Sinaloa
to you?
cartel, yeah, yeah, Sinaloa cartel is going to grow. The Gulf cartel that I mentioned,
Hmm.
they're going to actually make like a paramilitary wing called Los
No,
Zetas.
yeah, yeah, and I think even if you have like no idea about Mexican drug cartels, like you've heard of the
Mhm.
Zetas.
Yeah, the Zetas are insane, and that's a whole nother
Yeah,
story, right? So.
for sure. Yeah.
We can kind of keep it at that. Kind of brings us into like the 90s, and then we can talk about NAFTA and how NAFTA is bringing in avocados to the United States, and then eventually these two paths will cross.
Yeah, I know. Which like what we've talked about is like the history of how the drug cartels really got to where they are today. Well, to the 90s
Well,
at
kind of
least.
this little evolution of like, yeah,
Yeah, and it all started because the British wanted to trade opium, and now we
see,
have
it's the British
these.
fault, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Blame it on the British. And we have
Mhm.
these cartels that started because the Chinese Exclusion Act, they were
Yep,
forced out of the US, still had to leave China, went to Mexico. These like, voluntary human smuggling routes where Chinese still wanted to get in.
yep,
Then they started upping it to Chinese and opium. Then they went to alcohol, and then it was just
yep,
this whole thing.
yep.
The need kept growing. They went to Colombia, they
Hmm.
introduced cocaine, now it moved over to Mexico, and like it's crazy how like just one thing leads to another, and it just
Yeah,
keeps growing.
right.
Like for next episode, we're going to talk about how the avocado trade got involved, how the drug lords got involved with that, and
Hmm.
how NAFTA kind of opened the door for that. Which is again something that like as we're talking about when we're starting being like, yeah, the Chinese workers on the railroads were being paid with opium. You're not like,
Hmm.
I see how this ties into NAFTA and avocados. I get it.
Yes, yes.
Like yeah, it's like it all makes sense now. Like
That's
it's
right.
just kind of wild how all of these things piggybacked off of one another to lead to what we're seeing today, which
Yeah,
is everything we'll go into next week. Just as fascinating, if not more, because we get
yeah.
people like, the Mexican Knights Templar and all that
Oh
stuff.
my gosh, yeah. The Knights Templar, that guy, like Navarro, he's
Yeah,
insane.
absolutely. I mean, like, just wild. Los Caballeros Templarios
Yep, yep.
and their burros.
Yeah, Navarro, yeah. Well, I
But
would say
yeah,
that, this is obviously like a simplified version. There's way more associated with this evolution of drug cartels. I didn't go into like the marijuana tax acts in the 20s and stuff like that.
right.
Because there's an anti-Mexican sentiment that also comes about, this other racial like aspect of it. So, this is kind of a wave tops version, but it's still interesting,
I,
obviously.
I think so, and I think maybe in the next episode too we can talk about the like you said the marijuana tax act and what was the guy's name like Hearst or something who runs
Oh
all the
yeah. Well, maybe that's like one of our extra episodes because that's like definitely like a rabbit hole. Yeah, it's
okay
William
yeah
Randolph Hearst, DuPont,
right
right? Why
hmm
why we use paper from trees versus from a hemp plant? Yeah. Oh yeah,
yeah
it's
and then like
crazy.
Pablo Escobar gets thrown in there or no
No, not Pancho Villa.
yeah like wait a minute
Like, hey, Pablo Escobar time traveled back.
yeah he did everyone knows he's a time traveler do you not watch Doctor
He's in,
Who come on
he's in the woods. Yeah,
edit delete.
hiding out.
Okay, well, anyway, that's what's coming on our next episode. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for listening. We really appreciate it. I hope that this episode was entertaining and you learned something. I really enjoy talking about it because American history and just North American
Yeah.
history is super cool, and it goes all the way back to like the Opium Wars that Jess was talking about. So, hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll tune in next episode and hear how all of this really pays off and where we go from here.
Yep. Thanks again for listening to Farms and Frontlines.